Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs, that podcast that talks about anything security, compliance, fraud, scam, risk, and anything that has to do with safety and security in the crypto space. And today we have a very, very interesting guest, Chris DePauw. Chris is the principal head of compliance advisory and KYC at Gemini. He is the former head of risk management advisory at Elliptic and former vice president global financial crimes and compliance at JP Morgan. Chris, did I miss anything?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Great. So maybe before we dive into the questions, just a quick question about, your role in Gemini. What are you doing? What is basically principal advisory with respect to compliance and KYC and so on?
Yeah, so happy to dive into that a bit. I cover two main areas. One is compliance advisory, so advising on regulatory requirements, helping to navigate the regulatory landscape both in the US and globally, and working with our legal team to address issues that come up with regard to regulatory obligations, both current and pending. And then on the KYC side, primarily responsible for the onboarding and account review functions, making sure that we're onboarding the customers that we want to, that they fall within our risk appetite, and then conducting account reviews in a reasonably designed manner to make sure that we're mitigating any financial crime risk appropriately.
Got it. And do you mostly work with retail clients or institutional as well?
It's a combination. Yeah. I mean, Gemini has a significant institutional and retail client population. So we get to touch a little bit of everything.
Got it. So you went from JP Morgan, kind of the more fiat side of things and TradFi side of things. Then you went to Elliptic, which is obviously a blockchain intelligence company and so many more things. And now you're actually hands-on on the crypto. How is the experience of going through all that, through that journey? And what have you learned from it? How do you view, the crypto industry now after doing those several roles in different spaces?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was very fortunate during my time at JP Morgan to have managers and leadership who were both concerned with mitigating risk effectively and at the same time making sure that we were aligned with emerging technologies and had the ability to address things like crypto risk. And so was able to gain some experience there, helping to build out their crypto due diligence program, and eventually was looking at Elliptic, potentially either as a knowledge source or a vendor, or who knew, right? I just knew of them as a leader in the industry, and began following some of the content that was then being produced by David Carlisle, who's their VP for policy and is a great thought leader in the industry. Began reading quite a bit of his content. I saw they had a position available for what was then the role as a senior advisor for financial institution regulation and compliance. And I knew I wanted to stay in the regulatory space, and I wanted to have the ability to impact the ways in which financial institutions, crypto native entities, DeFi, et cetera, look to address fin crime risk. And Elliptic seemed like a great fit for that. Was fortunate enough to apply and get that role. And then during my time there was eventually given the remit of risk management advisory more generally, not just covering FIs, but advising on the creation and management of compliance programs for all different types of crypto institutions, particularly when it came to the implementation of blockchain analytics solutions, and also did some internal product compliance and risk management work there as well. So great team over there, great leadership. I know Liat has been a guest on the podcast here before. Fantastic professional, someone that I really admire and was really lucky to work with. So it was a outstanding experience. And I spent a few years there, learned a ton about blockchain analytics and the sort of more investigative side of crypto risk more generally, and wanted to at some point get to experience life inside of a major crypto exchange. And so when I was looking for opportunities, Gemini really stood out to me as a place that, one, embraces regulatory compliance and is known to have a best-in-class compliance program. They're folks that really take things seriously on the compliance front, which is not always the case in any financial services firm, right? Let alone crypto. And their reputation was outstanding. Also, knowing some of the folks in the leadership on the compliance side here had great reputations, and I'd been very strongly encouraged to talk to them. And I have not been disappointed, right? The robustness of the compliance program here is really as strong as it could possibly be. I would say it's in line with any major bank or other financial institution, which is great because then you have the support from the top down to do what's right, to do what's need to be done, and to still do business in a sort of top class way. So yeah, couldn't be happier with the decision, and really impressed by the way that compliance as a concept has matured and evolved in crypto so quickly. If you look at the TradFi space, right? The Bank Secrecy Act came in the 70s, and there's been a very slow evolution of the implementation of different controls in that space, which is natural, right? There was the laws have to be written, the regs have to be implemented, the programs have to be designed. To see what crypto has been able to do when it comes to effectively mitigating really novel financial crime and other compliance issues in a very, very short period of time has been tremendous. And I think that the use of tools like blockchain analytics, the ability to see through more than just your direct counterparty and perhaps more proactively and more effectively evaluate risk has been something that's been really rewarding as a compliance professional.
Yeah, we'll dive into that in a second, and we'll definitely talk about blockchain analytics and transaction monitoring and so on, because I believe that it's your bread and butter on a daily basis. But I have to ask, kind of the overarching thing that affects compliance, and basically compliance is a derivative of the regulation, right? And regulation is obviously, as people say, blockchain is global, knows no borders, no boundaries, but regulation is very local. So I'm curious, I guess that when you were at Elliptic, you had to analyze different regulatory frameworks. And now in Gemini, you probably have to do that as well, because Gemini have several licenses in Europe and in the US and so on. So what kind of differences can you spot between the different regulatory framework? Maybe if you can bundle them kind of to give me kind of the quick 101 about them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there is a tremendous amount of variation globally among different crypto regulators. Just one thing I would maybe comment on, though, I agree that certainly the regulatory environment plays a major role in how compliance programs are designed. But the one thing that I think, if not supersedes, certainly is equal to regulatory initiatives and the implementation of new rules and regs is in the compliance space is firm-wide risk appetite. And so compliance is certainly about mitigating regulatory risk effectively. It's also making sure that you're doing things in a way that your management team is comfortable with, that your investors are comfortable with, right? So I would say it is slightly broader than just regulatory risk. And for that reason, I think a lot of really best-in-class firms implement programs that work from a sort of global perspective down. And so you're always going to have local due diligence uplifts based on the unique requirements of a particular jurisdiction. But what I think is something I've seen at most of the really strong institutions I've had the chance to look at has been a consistent approach whereby you're setting global standards, right? You're saying this is what we are comfortable with. This is what international regulatory bodies and regulatory coordinating organizations, things like FATF, have said are appropriate standards for risk appetite and appropriate ways to address different risk factors that might come up. And then using that to really determine what you're okay with at sort of an entity-wide or an enterprise-wide level, and then implementing those local requirements. As far as variation among local regulators, in some jurisdictions there's still not much, and I don't think that's breaking news to anyone, right? There are some places in the world where people seek out regulatory arbitrage opportunities, and where there maybe isn't as fulsome and helpful a regulatory body as there is in, say, the United States, in most of Europe, in large parts of Asia at this point. I think that when it comes to comparing different regulatory regimes, the US is an interesting model because there are both regs set at sort of the federal level, right? Bank Secrecy Act obligations and things that will roll down to any money services business, which all crypto exchanges are. And then there are the state level regulators. So obviously Gemini is in part regulated by the New York State Department of Financial Services, which has really been the leader in setting crypto regs nationally so far, right? And I think the other states are catching up. And certainly there are a lot of really strong regulators in the US, but it is unique because you have 50 different opportunities for regulation in the overlay from the federal government. And so making sure that you're able to design a program that meets each of those standards in any jurisdiction in which you're operating, looking out for any conflicts, that's always a challenge, but also a super interesting intellectual exercise. In the EU, MiCA has been a game changer, right? And particularly when it comes to stablecoin markets, defining what is and isn't an acceptable stablecoin within the EU context, and generally taking a very proactive approach in embracing crypto-specific regulation that maybe other jurisdictions have not seen yet. I think we've seen a broad attempt to port regs from TradFi over to crypto, which is not a bad approach, right? Like I completely appreciate that these are precepts that should apply to any type of institution operating in the financial services sector, irrespective of what products you're offering. But on top of that, having really clear guidance on what's required for the very interesting and unique nuances that crypto presents is important. And MiCA's gone at least a part of the way in addressing that. And I think we'll see more development over time there. When you look at Asia, I think for a lot of folks, Singapore is the first body that comes to, or excuse me, the first jurisdiction that comes to mind. And Moss has been, tremendously impactful in setting standards there. They also have an interesting identity framework, right? The fact that SingPass is something that exists presents some unique challenges and opportunities for compliance programs. And so I really see them as one of the primary leaders in the APAC region. Although that's not to say that there aren't other major centers that should be taken into consideration. In Australia, Austrac has issued some really helpful guidance and has set some guardrails as to what is and isn't appropriate. Obviously, Hong Kong has a huge crypto market and is developing rapidly as well. So there are really major centers of crypto that I think are setting standards for what is acceptable globally, and that's cascading down to other regions over time. I'm really hopeful that in the long run, every jurisdiction will have a crypto regulatory regime that enables this technology and this sort of financial transformation powerhouse that is the digital asset sector to flourish, while at the same time putting up those controls and guardrails that are necessary to prevent the types of fin crime that I think we're all looking to snuff out.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of to summarize everything for me to understand, you're saying that basically you have kind of a one-size-fits-all approach with some kind of basics in terms of the regulatory standards that you're applying, and then you have the smaller nuances in every jurisdiction. Now, I imagine, sorry.
No, please. I agree in part, right? One size fits all is maybe a bit too broad. I would say that there are standards that exist when it comes to financial crime risk, reputational risk, all of that stuff that exist at an enterprise level, and that they cascade down, and those are going to be principles based. We don't want bad actors as customers. We don't want to facilitate bad activity, right? And here are the ways in which we implement controls to ensure that those things don't happen. And what I think you were alluding to, and which I agree fully with, is you'll then have an uplift at the local level to make sure that whatever you're doing in, country A, right, comports with the specific requirements there. The way that you do customer identification and verification in one jurisdiction might not exactly mirror the way you do it in another. It's not that one is better or worse. There are just different reasonable approaches that regulators can take. And so you have these broad concepts of how your compliance program should operate. And then the specifics of what's required in a particular jurisdiction will happen through proceduralization.
Yeah, I totally get it. So I'm guessing that, being a US-based company and primarily a US company before you sprung out to other jurisdictions, you probably have the highest standards with respect to, SEC rules and so on, securities and so on. But when it comes to, for instance, AML rules, right? Mm-hmm. How does that work? More specifically, what are you obligated to check? So you mentioned earlier the blockchain and analytics companies that are helping you and other tools and so on. Upon receiving funds and sending funds, if you can summarize, what are your regulatory obligations?
That's a podcast in and of itself, right? To put it at a really high level, I think what we're always seeking to do from a compliance program perspective when it comes to transaction monitoring, investigations, all those types of functions, is to identify activity that either sits outside of our firm-wide risk appetite, is illicit in nature in some ways, indicative of some type of potentially suspicious behavior, and to address that appropriately, whether it's with a regulatory filing, whether it's with an enhanced control or a customer risk exit, right? If there's something that we really feel like we can't get comfortable with. And the tooling with which we do that is going to vary pretty substantially. It's important to, for instance, understand the IP location of a customer to make sure they're not logging in from a sanctioned jurisdiction, for instance, right? It's important to look on chain using blockchain analytics vendors to make sure that there's not a direct or indirect nexus to some sort of bad actor, to a dark web marketplace, say, or to a sanctioned person, or to someone subject to FinCEN special measures, or all types of categories we would look at through our investigative processes. And then it's also important to assess your customer holistically at onboarding. So you have to ask the right questions. Do we know what this entity, for instance, does? Do we know what jurisdiction this person's in? There are sort of myriad different conflating factors that can come into place that might make you not comfortable with a particular relationship. And that's why it's so critical not only to have extremely well-designed in-house compliance policies and procedures that you're implementing effectively, but also to use best-in-class vendors to make sure that for the things that you can't sort of homebrew, right, and wouldn't be appropriate to, you have tools in place that are effective to mitigate the types of risks that you're going to see flowing into the industry.
Yeah, for sure. I want to kind of zoom into the on-chain element that you've mentioned, right? So true story, we oftentimes see in the system on a daily basis, basically some irregularities with respect to some exchanges, right? So we can see that, some exchange, quite a prominent one, I'm not going to mention names, right? And it's not Gemini, have received funds from, we traced it back to a mixer, right? Or a sanctioned entity. Now, it's not that easy to trace it because you have to go back not 2, not 3, but many more hops.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes you have a bridge in the middle or a DAX or an aggregator and so on. But eventually we managed to track it back automatically. So then we reached out to a friend of mine who's a compliance manager there. And he said, yeah, we don't care because it doesn't pass the threshold of what we actually have to check. Because we all know that the current tools, and again, not mentioning names, are very limited. First of all, they're not real time, meaning that they do not trace it back in real time. So you can send a significant amount of funds from a mixer, and then you will know about it. It will be updated and attributed and flagged in the system after 2-3 days, maybe even a week. And second, they don't track it back as much, right? So they can go 2 hops, 3 hops, but then they lose track. So how does it work from your end, and what's your take on it?
Yeah, so that has not been my experience with blockchain analytics vendors. I've been lucky to work with different tools over the years, both as a user and as an employee, right, that can do things like look at very close to real-time updates in blockchain activity. So you're looking, if something happens on chain, that's going to be updated within the system, ideally very, very shortly afterward, because you're live scanning the blockchain theoretically, right? And then updating your clustering effectively to reflect that. It is true that sometimes there are cases in which you might not receive the totality of information that you might want from a compliance perspective. And that can be particularly true when it comes to screening, right? Where I think there's much more opportunity to look at things in a very clear and broad way is through the use of an investigative product. And that's something that I think has to be differentiated. There are both screening tools and investigative tools that are applicable in a blockchain analytics context. Sort of similar for anyone that's in the TradFi world to like your sanctioned screening tool, right? Versus your investigative suite of products that you might leverage. And for on the screening side, different vendors have different limitations, functionality, et cetera. There's more than one way to attack that problem. And I would hesitate to say that any one is necessarily inherently better than the other. But when it comes to investigations, right, you want to be able to trace through many, many, many layers of different unhosted intermediaries, for instance, until you can get back to the party that's causing you concern, or to any type of downstream or upstream risk that you might be looking into for investigative purposes within your firm. And so I understand, and I would never disagree that no product is perfect, right? Everything has limitations. But at the same time, that hop-based approach, for instance, I think that most folks would agree is not really a sufficient way to look at things, right? You want to look at percentage of exposure. You want to look at different attributes that wallets are engaging in, from a concentration of risk perspective, which I do think that the majority of the mainstream blockchain analytics vendors in the space today are doing it in a pretty effective way. And certainly we feel confident that our program is designed and that the tools we're using are sufficient in such a way as to allow us to really accurately identify financial crime risk and to mitigate it effectively.
Yeah, I totally understand. Can you kind of give us the behind the scenes of what happened? So let's say you made a mistake, right? Or maybe the blockchain and analytics company that you're working with haven't catched, a specific transaction. What happens then? And again, you don't have to take like specific use cases that happened, in theory. What happens then? Is it something that the regulators know, or do you have to report it, and in what way?
That's an interesting question. So without speaking to anything Gemini specific, because I don't want to necessarily get into the specifics of how we operate or what our processes are. I think very generally, if you find that something was missed from a blockchain analytics perspective, right, and you later find that there was some sort of risk, maybe they updated their clustering and you see, oh, there was a transaction that happened 6 months ago. At the time it was unlabeled. It's now labeled as bad guy X, right? We have to do something about it. Your obligations are going to vary pretty substantially based on what that new label is. So if it's a label related to just general bad activity, we find out that this person was a drug dealer, or this, I shouldn't say this person, but this cluster is associated with an entity that's engaged in drug dealing. It's a dark market, for instance, right? You may at that point investigate customer associations with that dark marketplace, see if any of the activity that previously looked to be, fairly innocuous might in fact have some elements of financial crime risk or suspiciousness that merit a regulatory filing or a conversation about whether it's appropriate to retain a customer relationship. If you're finding that the new attribution has to do with sanctions, right, depending on timing and depending on your actual obligations in the jurisdiction in which you're operating, because sanctions programs globally operate very differently, right? The way that you handle sanctions risk under OFAC is very different from the way you might handle it under His Majesty's Treasury, for instance, right? Depending on the specific sanctions regime you're dealing with, there might be different obligations that spring from that other than just simply reporting, right? There could be obligations to segregate funds and that type of stuff as well. And so it's always going to be about looking into the regs to see what the specific requirements are based on the financial crime typology that presents itself and then acting on that. I think what can be challenging is when you have activity that occurred pre-attribution, right? You could not have known at the time. There's an exercise then of making sure that your current customer population and the current transactional activity that you're seeing is reflective of your current risk appetite. And that if there was something that you didn't know at the time was bad, but turns out it was, you've got to action that appropriately. And that's why having a robust compliance program is so important.
Got it. So maybe let's talk about kind of a more recent use case, right? That is constantly on the news. So we have the Bybit mega hack, $1.5 billion stolen. We're still in the aftermath of that. How concerned should regulated exchanges be of some of those funds landing in their wallets, and how can they prevent it?
Yep, very. I mean, that's the short answer here is that they should be extremely concerned. So I think one of the big challenges with any hack that is attributed ultimately to a state actor, this appears to be associated with North Korea, for instance, right, is that you're dealing with very sophisticated, well-financed groups that are acting in coordination with each other, and it's very difficult to fight back against from a single institution perspective. It's why our partnerships with law enforcement and regulators are so vital, right? Like we depend on those folks to help with the actual enforcement and the real world taking down of these enterprises. And they do a phenomenal job, particularly in the US. I can't speak highly enough about our regulatory and law enforcement partners and the work that they do to help create a safe and secure crypto ecosystem. As for what different financial institutions and exchanges should do, it's difficult because as I'm sure folks watching this know, you can't reject a transaction in crypto, right? If someone's got your digital wallet address, they send funds there, you've got those funds and you have to do something with them. And there are different ways.
That's why exchanges have basically deposit addresses that are kind of, we can have more than one. And then if one is kind of burned, so to speak, then you can use another one and so on. And that way it's segregated.
Yes and no. So it is, but it's still tricky because it's an interesting conundrum. When you are an exchange, blockchain analytics platforms are clustering you as well, right? So if someone sends, exchange X, $10,000 worth of, dirty Bitcoin, okay, that came from some sort of untenable or unpalatable place, the analytics companies then see those funds flowing in are going to attribute risk based on that flow of funds to the enterprise. And even if you never touched that wallet again, well, it's likely had interactivity with a bunch of your other wallets. And so there's this co-contaminant risk that emerges. And that's tough because there's nothing you actually could have done to reject a digital wallet transaction, right? Once your address is out there to receive funds, even if it's going into an omnibus structure, even if it's not a permanent wallet, it can't fully be isolated from everything else because on-chain activity is public, right? For the most part, for the vast majority of chains. And so you can then see where those funds move. And if it's going to other wallets associated with the exchange, then you've got the same problem. It's moving from, wallet A to wallet B. As for what you can do to ensure that you're not helping to facilitate any money laundering of the stolen funds, a lot of that comes down to having a really strong transaction monitoring and investigations program within your firm, and looking to ensure that if funds are coming from places that you think are problematic, right? There have been some exchanges that are basically no KYC exchanges that have been called out by major blockchain analytics providers as being a nexus to where these stolen funds are being laundered through. You should be looking at transactions with those exchanges very skeptically when you're conducting an investigation. When you're talking about transaction monitoring, a lot of it is going to be about proactively screening wallets to make sure that you're comfortable with the overall financial crime risk that you're presenting when they're interacting with your customers, or are your customer, right? Making sure that your customer is not dealing with some sort of bad actor. It's the blessing and the curse of crypto is that we have this transparent, inalterable blockchain where you can see everything forever. Again, for the most part, there are privacy coins where that varies slightly, but for the most part. And because of that, much more than you would in a traditional financial services context. That's a great thing for compliance officers. It's also a really tricky thing because you have a lot more information to digest, and what you can see, the folks in the regulatory world can see as well. And so there's a broader appreciation for where risk is flowing. One thing that's been super helpful is the way in which different analytics providers, investigative firms, consultancies, right, have really been tackling this Bybit issue and following the flows of funds. Some of that money has already been returned, right, which is a great thing. But yeah, it's a very tough issue. One of the most important things that we as an industry can do is help to prevent that in the future. So I think it's still unclear exactly why it happened. Different folks are pointing to different potential, weak points in the chain here, so to speak. And I won't comment on any of those. I think that everyone has really done their best. But again, when you're dealing with a state actor that's seeking to exploit a very minor, software development flaw or whatever the case might be, to exploit a human through a phishing attack that might be extremely sophisticated, which I think unfortunately has been very commonplace in the industry, it's really difficult to deal with unless you have a compliance program, whether you are an exchange or whether you are a wallet provider or whatever entity type you might be, that has extremely strong controls built in. Ultimately, the best thing we can do from a money laundering perspective is to design investigative systems, transaction monitoring programs, and controls, both detective and proactive, that can appropriately help us to identify this activity. And when it does come in, if you can't reject it, identify it, report on it effectively, consider customer relationships. And when it's going out, when you can, proactively prevent that money from being sent out to the bad actor. What becomes really tough is if, the funds are sent to just someone's unhosted wallet, right? And then later on, that unhosted wallet sends it through several other unhosted, and they end up at the bad actor ultimately. And that's why I think the investigative process in crypto is so uniquely interesting, because you have this incredible amount of information that you can digest and look at. And it's why I really value the partnership that we have with our investigative and transaction monitoring teams.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when you see the entire sequence, you don't know the full picture until it actually lands in a wallet that is clustered or lands at some shady exchange that launders it. And only then you have that aha moment when you understand that, okay, this is what it's all about. They are affiliated with this and that, and that's basically a money laundering scheme.
Sure.
But I'm curious, with respect to Bybit, I think it's quite easy, quote unquote, given the fact that, it's Lazarus and DPRK that are behind it, which is a sanctioned nation state and so on. But if we're talking about, let's say, an anonymous hacker that is not affiliated with any sanctioned entity, how do you view funds coming from a hack? What's the sensitivity with respect to that? Because I can imagine, drug money and other malicious funds and so on. But with respect to hacks, how do you view those funds that originated from a hack?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, you have to view them as being of the highest possible risk, right? Anytime you have funds that you know are derived from an illicit source, ultimately, you can't have um, a posture that allows you to not react to that and to not handle it effectively and in line with your global regulatory obligations. So if you see someone that received a bunch of money from a hack, for instance, right? One, that's a conversation probably with your law enforcement partners and with your regulators, whether it's through the filing of a suspicious activity report plus independent outreach, right? That's going to vary depending on facts and circumstances. But two, that customer is going to be under quite a bit of scrutiny, right? Like I think there's going to it's hard to and unwise to retain a customer relationship with someone that you believe is engaging knowingly in some sort of illicit activity or criminal enterprise. It's why the onboarding function and the account review functions within a crypto exchange are so important, because ideally you're mitigating some of this risk up front by only onboarding people that you're comfortable with. Now, people can look great on paper and have no sort of red flags that pop up during the onboarding phase. And then later on, through your ongoing monitoring processes, you detect that, wow, they're receiving funds or sending funds to a hacker or to a fraud shop or to a scam, right? And then it comes down to differentiating between someone who might be the victim of this type of activity. Scams are an obvious example where someone's sending money to a scam. They may not be the bad guy, so to speak, versus when your customer might in fact be engaging in illegal activity, right? If they're receiving money from that same scam, that could be indicative of the fact that they're involved in some way. Now, again, whether or
Yeah,
not that's
just one small comment. You have to add to that the fact that you now can buy or even rent an identity, right? So somebody
absolutely.
can go through the KYC process, through the onboarding process, and be crystal clean. And then, on the off-chain level and offline level, they are affiliated with some malicious actor and start receiving funds from them. And they appear, a very low risk at first, but then you understand that on-chain it looks very different.
Yeah, it's a game of whack-a-mole, right? And you're always trying to stay one step ahead of the bad guys who are attempting to infiltrate your organization in order to exploit you for, financial crime purposes effectively. It goes back to that point I mentioned earlier, which is having strong vendors in the space is so incredibly important, because you want to be able to understand whether an ID, for instance, that is being fed into your system is fraudulent, it's a fake ID. People try all the time to use IDs with mismatched names or to use IDs that are, photoshopped in some way, right? And having the ability to detect that, to understand whether or not the identity information you have on file is really reflective of the identity information of the person that's executing transactions is one of the most important parts of the KYC process.
Yeah, for sure. So before we wrap up, I have to ask you about financial crime and fraud and scam in particular. So from our data from Cyvers, we saw that during 2024, $5.5 billion were stolen in pig butchering scams alone. And obviously, you also have rug pulls and you have phishing scams and address poisoning and so on. But pig butchering is something that is of a magnitude that we have never seen. How can you protect your clients? And we talked about the deposit side of things. Let's talk about the withdrawal side of things now. How can you protect your clients from falling victim to such scams? And how can you actually do that, given the fact that, again, you don't know that the wallet that the money flows into is a malicious wallet. Maybe it's even a new unhosted wallet. How do you know that?
Yeah, it's a tough issue, and pig butchering is such a sad phenomenon, right? Like these are often people who are, eh, lonely or interested romantically or have been tricked, or there are many different permutations of this that can arrive, and there's such a horrible human cost to this beyond just the financial ramifications, which are obviously devastating. These are people's lives and emotions that are being, ruined or really harmed in a lot of instances. And so I think it's top of mind for everybody. As for how you do it, I think there are a bunch of things that you have to do. One is encouraging education whenever possible, and it's not something that exchanges can do alone. It's where I think our partners come in handy as well, but making sure that there's a great deal of information available to the public about pig butchering scams, about the way in which they operate. Regulators play a major role in this too. There have been regulatory advisories that have been issued by FinCEN, for instance, about pig butchering, which I think is helpful. And I wish there were a way to convince more of the general population to take a look at those advisories and to become more aware of what financial crime or exploitation schemes are out there. It's a big ask, right? To ask people to keep up to date. You're someone that's just working your job and you're going to be reading FinCEN bulletins all day. It's not super realistic. So I think that we have to find better ways to educate the public. And then once you've got the problem, though, it's looking for patterns of activity where people are seen to be sending money ultimately to places that we know are associated with scams or fraud, right? And in the case of pig butchering, you're right in saying that many times these funds initially go to an unhosted wallet, let's say, but downstream, those wallets end up delivering funds out to, clustered bad actors a lot of the time, because there are typically coordinated efforts involved in pig butchering. It's not usually a standalone scam event, although that does happen too. But ensuring that you're investigating all of those downstream impacts and looking at where funds are ultimately flowing is important. Customer outreach and being responsive is also a hugely important thing, right? Your customers will oftentimes let you know when they've been defrauded, and making sure that you have appropriate processes in place to handle customer complaints is a really imperative aspect of this. The other thing that becomes difficult here, though, is sometimes there's a shame element where people don't want to acknowledge that they've been scammed, right? Or they've been exploited by a romance scam or a pig butcher or whatever you want to call them. And because of that, you sometimes have to look out for folks' best interest, even when they're not necessarily willing to. And that's why I think having both detective and proactive controls in place to address these different types of risk typologies is super important. And it's about staying a step ahead of the bad guys, right? Compliance is a challenging job because you're never done, right? There's always someone else trying to exploit you. There's always someone coming up with a new way to scam you. And so you're constantly in this mode of hypervigilance. It's what makes it challenging. It's also what makes it so uniquely rewarding, because the work you do has a material impact on people's lives, and you have the ability to prevent people from being exploited, to help limit exposure to financial crime for your firm, and to help national security interests when it comes to things like sanctions and terrorist financing, by identifying and reporting on that type of activity appropriately and reducing its occurrence when you can. And so I have loved my career. I'm very happy to be where I am. I'm very happy to be with an organization that takes compliance as seriously as Gemini does. And I really encourage folks to educate themselves on fraud risk and financial crime risk as much as they can, and to always invest and transact wisely.
Yeah. So you've mentioned education, and obviously, both from the regulatory standpoint and from the exchanges standpoint. And I have to say, a funny or rather sad story is one of the exchanges that we're working with. We identified a transaction that went out from the exchange wallet to a pig butchering affiliated wallet that eventually we tracked and figured out that it was part of a pig butchery network. So the exchange went back to the client and reached out to them and talked to them and explained that, listen, the two transactions that you sent, it's not who you think it is. And they tried to investigate that. And the individual, the victim, was arguing with them and basically did not want to admit that the person on the other side is not, this beautiful lady that wants him to invest, or her, whatever.
Sure.
So it is a very, very uphill battle, because, again, you can help. And again, we're working with quite a few exchanges where we identify hundreds of millions of dollars a year that were supposed to be stolen. But then you obviously have the user side of things, which is more kind of not technological, but psychological. And it will remain challenging for sure.
Yeah, it's really incredibly sad, because you're taking people from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. You're taking someone from the point of, I'm in love and I'm going to make a bunch of money with this person who loves me, and telling them that's all fake, you've been scammed. And they feel, they may feel silly, or they may feel and I say they will likely feel horribly sad and exploited. And so there's a very understandable psychological human element to why people are resistant to coming to accept the truth here. And that's why it's important to have compliance functions that do this work, even when people aren't willing to acknowledge that they're being exploited.
Definitely. Chris, thank you so much for this fascinating overview. I had a lot of fun, very interesting, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. Take care.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.